Look down at the device in your hand, the screen you're staring at right now. What if this isn't liberation from ignorance, but just a more sophisticated cave? 2,400 years ago, Plato described prisoners chained in a cave, forced to watch shadows on a wall, mistaking those flickering projections for reality itself. When one prisoner escapes and sees the actual world outside, his fellow captives refuse to believe his descriptions of true reality, even threatening to kill him for challenging their shadow world. For centuries, we've congratulated ourselves on escaping Plato's cave. We've developed science, technology, global communication. We pride ourselves on seeing reality clearly, unlike those poor, deluded cave dwellers. But what if we never actually left the cave? What if we simply built more convincing, more immersive shadows? Hey there, welcome to the Hidden Academy. Today we're reimagining Plato's allegory of the cave for our modern world. And the implications might disturb you. In the next few minutes, I'll show you how today's shadows are more sophisticated but perhaps more deceptive than anything Plato imagined. You'll discover how our perceptual systems, technological environment, and social structures might be creating a multi-layered cave that's increasingly difficult to recognize, let alone escape. Most importantly, you'll learn how to spot the subtle chains that might be binding you to modern illusions, and what seeing beyond them might reveal about the nature of reality itself. The ancient Greek word for truth, aletheia, literally means the state of not being hidden. What remains hidden from us today might not be what you expect. What if the most profound deception isn't that we're trapped in a cave, but that we've convinced ourselves we're already free? Before we explore our modern cave, let's revisit what Plato actually described in The Republic, written around 375 BC. Picture this. Prisoners are chained in a cave since childhood, fixed in position, able to see only what's directly in front of them, a blank wall. Behind them burns a fire, and between the fire and prisoners runs a raised walkway where people carry various objects. The prisoners see only the shadows these objects cast on the wall. Having never seen anything else, the prisoners believe these shadows to be reality itself. They give names to the shadows, discuss them, and even develop expertise in predicting which shadows will appear next. Their entire concept of truth is limited to increasingly accurate predictions about shadow patterns. Then something extraordinary happens. One prisoner is freed and forced to turn around. Initially, the fire's light blinds and pains him. When told that what he previously saw were mere projections and that this new reality is more real, he struggles to believe it. The objects casting the shadows seem less real to him than the shadows themselves. Next, he's dragged outside the cave into daylight. The sun temporarily blinds him. Gradually, his eyes adjust. First, he can only look at shadows, then reflections in water, then the objects themselves, and finally, he can gaze at the sun directly, understanding it as the source of all he sees. When this enlightened prisoner returns to the cave to free his fellow captives, something tragic happens. His eyes, now accustomed to sunlight, can't adjust quickly to the cave's darkness. He stumbles, appears foolish. To the other prisoners, this proves that leaving the cave damages one's perception. When he describes the world outside, they think him mad and threaten to kill him if he tries to free them. This allegory serves multiple purposes in Plato's philosophy. Most obviously, it illustrates his theory of forms, the idea that the physical world we perceive is merely a shadow of true reality, the forms or ideas that exist beyond physical manifestation. The sun represents the form of the good, the source of all truth and being. But the allegory also functions as a political and educational parable. The freed prisoner represents the philosopher who, having glimpsed truth, has a duty to return and enlighten others, even at personal risk. The cave dweller's hostile reaction represents society's resistance to fundamental challenges to its worldview. What makes Plato's allegory so enduring is how it captures a fundamental human condition. We mistake our limited perspective for the totality of reality, and we resist evidence that our worldview might be fundamentally incomplete. Now, 2,400 years later, we might smile at this ancient story, confident that science, technology, and education have freed us from such naivete. We've split the atom, mapped the human genome, built global communication networks, and visited the moon. Surely we've left the cave far behind. Or have we? What if our modern condition isn't an escape from Plato's cave, but an evolution of it? What if our cave has simply become larger, more sophisticated, and more convincing? Consider that the prisoners in Plato's cave had one significant advantage over us. They were chained, physically forced to face the wall. Their limitation was obvious, impossible to overlook. Our modern chains are largely invisible. Psychological, technological, and social constraints we've internalized so completely that we mistake them for freedom. The 20th century philosopher Martin Heidegger argued that the greatest danger of modern technology isn't what it might do to us, but how it shapes our way of seeing reality. Technology, he suggested, frames the world as a standing reserve, resources waiting to be optimized and consumed. This framing isn't presented as one perspective among many, but as reality itself. Similarly, media theorist Marshall McLuhan famously observed, "We don't know who discovered water, but we're pretty sure it wasn't a fish." We swim in our technological and social environment so completely that we can barely perceive how it shapes everything we see. The shadows on today's cave walls are cast not by simple objects passed before a fire, but by complex, interlocking systems of technology, media, language, and social organization. Systems so pervasive that we rarely think to question them. And unlike Plato's simple shadows, our modern projections are interactive. They respond to us, creating the powerful illusion that we're seeing and engaging with reality directly rather than through carefully constructed representations. What might these modern shadows look like? And how might we begin to recognize the cave we currently inhabit? The answers require looking not just at obvious illusions, but at the fundamental frameworks through which we perceive and interpret everything around us. Frameworks so embedded in our experience that they have become invisible to us. Just as the prisoners mistook shadows for reality because they knew nothing else, we might be mistaking our particular way of perceiving and organizing the world for reality itself. And the first step toward seeing beyond our modern cave is recognizing something remarkable. The limitations aren't just in what we see, but in how we see. The shadows on our modern cave wall come from multiple sources, creating layers of illusion more sophisticated than anything Plato could have imagined. Let's examine the most powerful shadow casters that shape our perception of reality. Our first shadow caster is perhaps the most fundamental, our own biology. The human brain isn't designed to perceive reality accurately. It's designed to keep us alive and reproducing. Our senses don't show us what's out there. They show us what was evolutionarily useful for our ancestors to detect. Consider vision. We perceive less than 1/10,000,000,000th of the electromagnetic spectrum. Imagine describing the richness of visible reality to someone who can only perceive radio waves. This is precisely our situation relative to what actually exists out there. Even within our narrow perceptual band, our brains actively construct what we experience rather than passively receiving information. Neuroscientist Neil Seth explains, "We don't just passively perceive the world, we actively generate it. The world we experience comes as much from the inside out as the outside in. Your visual system fills in your blind spot so completely that you're not aware it exists. Your brain predicts what should be there, and that prediction becomes your reality. This happens not just with basic perception, but with our entire experience of the world." Princeton neuroscientist Michael Graziano puts it bluntly, "Consciousness is a kind of con game the brain plays with itself. The brain is a computer that evolved to simulate the outside world. Among its internal models is a simulation of itself as a conscious being. Just as Plato's prisoners were confident they saw reality directly, we too are certain we're perceiving things as they are, unaware that our experience is a heavily edited, species-specific simulation constructed by neural processes we didn't choose and can't directly observe. The second shadowcaster is language. We typically think of language as a neutral tool that describes reality. But what if language actually creates the reality we perceive? Linguist Benjamin Lee Worf observed that language shapes how we categorize and attend to different aspects of experience. Speakers of languages that use different color categories literally perceive color boundaries differently. Languages with different tense systems foster different relationships to time. Even abstract concepts like freedom, love, or success aren't universal realities we discover. They're linguistic constructs that vary dramatically across cultures and eras. Yet once we adopt these constructs, they feel like discoveries rather than inventions. They become the invisible architecture through which we interpret everything we experience. As philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein observed, "The limits of my language mean the limits of my world." Like Plato's prisoners discussing the patterns of shadows on their wall, we mistake our linguistic categories for reality itself. Our third shadowcaster is social consensus. Humans are fundamentally social beings, with our brains wired to seek alignment with those around us, often at the expense of accuracy. The classic Asch conformity experiments demonstrated how readily people will deny their own clear perceptions when contradicted by a group. In these studies, participants frequently reported obviously incorrect answers to simple visual tasks when surrounded by confederates giving wrong answers. But modern research reveals something even more profound. Social influence doesn't just change what we're willing to report. It actually alters what we perceive. Brain imaging studies show that social pressure modifies activity in the visual cortex itself. We literally see differently when our perceptions conflict with the group. This isn't weakness. It's how our brains are designed to function. Throughout human evolution, being wrong but aligned with your tribe was often safer than being right but alone. Our neural architecture reflects this priority. Solomon Asch, reflecting on his conformity studies, noted, "The tendency to conformity in our society is so strong that reasonably intelligent and well-meaning young people are willing to call white black." Because of group pressure, like Plato's prisoners who threatened to kill anyone challenging their shadow reality, we have powerful biological drives to maintain social consensus, even when that consensus conflicts with evidence. Our fourth, and perhaps most powerful modern shadowcaster, is technology, particularly digital media and the attention economy. In Plato's allegory, the shadows were cast by objects randomly carried past a fire. In our modern cave, the shadows are engineered specifically to capture and hold our attention. They're designed by algorithms that know more about our psychological triggers than we know ourselves. Former Google design ethicist Tristan Harris explains, "Your telephone in the 1970s didn't have 1,000 engineers on the other side redesigning it to be more and more persuasive. Today's digital environment isn't a neutral tool. It's an architecture carefully optimized to modify your behavior. Each notification, autoplay feature, and infinite scroll mechanism exploits vulnerabilities in our attention systems. The result isn't just distraction. It's a fundamental reshaping of how we perceive reality itself. Studies show that heavy smartphone users actually develop different neural pathways for processing information. Their attention networks become rewired to expect and require constant novel stimulation. Reality itself begins to feel insufficient without digital enhancement. Meanwhile, algorithmic content delivery systems create personalized information environments, filter bubbles or reality tunnels that show us content similar to what we've engaged with before. Like Plato's prisoners who never turn their heads, we become increasingly trapped in narrow information corridors that reinforce existing beliefs while making contradictory perspectives invisible. The fifth shadowcaster is narrative. Humans are storytelling creatures. We naturally organize raw experience into coherent narratives that explain why things happen and what they mean. But these narratives aren't neutral reflections of reality. They're simplifications that impose pattern and meaning on the chaotic complexity of actual events. As novelist Tim O'Brien wrote, a thing may happen and be a total lie. Another thing may not happen and be truer than the truth. Our personal narratives about who we are, cultural narratives about our society, and historical narratives about our past aren't simply descriptions of reality. They actively shape what we notice, how we interpret events, and what possibilities we can imagine for the future. Psychologist Daniel Kahneman discovered that people evaluate experiences not based on the total or average enjoyment, but almost entirely on how they felt at the peak moment and at the end. The narrative structure matters more than the actual experience. The media extends this narrative distortion. News isn't a random sampling of world events, but a curated selection optimized for emotional impact and audience engagement. As media critic Neil Postman observed, how we define reality becomes how we experience reality. When combined, these shadow casters, biological constraints, language, social influence, technology, and narrative, create a multi-layered illusion far more convincing than the simple shadows in Plato's cave. Like his prisoners who named and studied the shadow patterns, we develop complex disciplines and expertise centered on phenomena that may be profound misinterpretations of a deeper reality. What makes our modern cave particularly difficult to recognize is that, unlike Plato's prisoners, we pride ourselves on being sophisticated, skeptical thinkers. We're aware of cognitive biases, media manipulation, and social influence. This meta-awareness creates a dangerous illusion of having transcended the very limitations that still constrain us. As philosopher Slavoj Zizek notes, the most dangerous illusion is that we've stepped out of illusion into the immediate real. But if we're still in the cave, what might real liberation look like? And how might we begin to turn away from the shadows towards something more fundamental? The answers may be both simpler and more radical than we imagine. If we accept that we're still in Plato's cave, albeit a more sophisticated one, the question becomes, what lies beyond it? And how might we begin to glimpse that deeper reality? In the original allegory, liberation wasn't a gradual improvement in predicting shadows. It required a radical reorientation, turning away from the shadows entirely and facing the previously unimaginable source of light. Similarly, transcending our modern cave requires more than incremental adjustments within our current frameworks. Let's explore 6 potential paths beyond today's shadows, each offering a different approach to breaking free from our modern chains. The first path lies through contemplative practices that have been refined across cultures for thousands of years. Meditation, in its various forms, trains practitioners to observe the mechanisms of their own consciousness, catching glimpses of how our reality is constructed rather than simply received. Neuroscientist Richard Davidson's research on long-term meditators shows they develop measurably different brain activity, particularly in regions associated with attention and emotional regulation. These practitioners don't just think differently about reality, they literally perceive it differently. One meditation technique specifically designed to pierce illusion is vipassana, or insight meditation. Rather than focusing on particular objects of attention, practitioners observe the process of perception itself, noticing how sensations, thoughts, and emotions arise and dissolve moment by moment. This practice reveals something profound. Much of what we take as solid reality consists of mental constructs that flicker in and out of existence like Plato's shadows. As Buddhist teacher Joseph Goldstein explains, what we take to be solid entities like the self or objects in the world are actually processes unfolding moment to moment. By observing these processes directly, practitioners report experiences remarkably similar to Plato's freed prisoner. Initial disorientation followed by recognition that what they previously took for reality was largely projection. like the prisoner whose eyes had to adjust gradually, first to shadows, then reflections, then objects themselves. Meditators describe a phased recognition of increasingly subtle levels of reality. The second path beyond the cave emerges through deep encounters with nature. Modern humans spend over 90% of our lives indoors, immersed in human-created environments that reflect our concepts back to us. This creates a closed loop of human projection that's hard to recognize from within. Wilderness immersion breaks this loop. When we step into ecosystems operating by principles entirely different from human social systems, something shifts in our perception. The Japanese practice of Shinrin-yoku, forest bathing, has been shown to create measurable changes in nervous system activity, stress hormone levels, and immune function. But the benefits go beyond physiological effects. Extended wilderness experiences often trigger what psychologists call awe, a complex emotion involving vastness and accommodation. The need to adjust our mental frameworks to incorporate something that doesn't fit. This emotion specifically helps dissolve our habitual categories and opens us to perceiving beyond our usual constructs. As writer Richard Louv notes, nature presents the young with something so much greater than they are. It offers an environment where they can easily contemplate infinity and eternity. Like Plato's prisoner, finally able to gaze at the stars and sun, direct encounter with nature's vastness can expand our perception beyond human-scaled shadows. The third path involves consciousness-altering substances, what anthropologist Wade Davis calls plants of the gods. Throughout human history, virtually every culture has discovered and utilized plants and fungi that temporarily disrupt ordinary perception, potentially offering glimpses beyond our perceptual cave. Modern neuroscience reveals how these substances work. Classic psychedelics like psilocybin, found in certain mushrooms, and LSD temporarily reduce activity in the brain's default mode network, the system responsible for maintaining our normal sense of self and reality. As this network's activity decreases, patterns of brain connectivity that don't normally communicate directly begin exchanging information. The result isn't random hallucination, but a systematic restructuring of perception that participants frequently describe as more real than real. Remarkably similar to Plato's prisoner, insisting that the world outside the cave was more real than the shadows within. Recent clinical research at institutions like Johns Hopkins and Imperial College London shows that properly conducted psychedelic experiences can create lasting changes in personality, worldview, and well-being. Participants often report dissolving boundaries between self and world, experiencing reality as a unified field rather than separate objects. Neuroscientist Robin Carhart-Harris suggests these experiences offer a pivotal mental state that allows people to break out of rigid patterns of thought and behavior. Like Plato's prisoner being forcibly turned toward the light, these experiences can initiate perspective shifts that remain accessible even after the substance has worn off. The fourth path, beyond the cave, runs through radical confrontation with mortality. When death becomes real rather than abstract, our usual preoccupations often reveal themselves as shadows. Psychologist Irvin Yalom's work with terminal patients reveals how facing death can shatter conventional frameworks and open unusual clarity. As one patient told him, "Cancer cured my neurosis," meaning that the imminence of death had dissolved her previous anxieties by revealing their insubstantiality. This aligns with research on near-death experiences, NDEs. Regardless of their metaphysical interpretation, these experiences reliably produce dramatic shifts in values and perception. A typical NDE participant reports, "I realized that all my life I had been preoccupied with things that weren't important at all." In controlled research settings, even simulated near-death experiences produce similar effects. Psychologist William Richards developed a therapeutic protocol using blindfolds, headphones, and specific music to simulate the experiential elements of an NDE. Participants showed lasting decreases in death anxiety and increases in measures of psychological openness and sense of meaning. The fifth path involves disrupting our usual social patterns. Remember that social consensus is one of our primary shadow casters. Anthropologists have long recognized that immersion in radically different cultures can create a perspective shift called culture shock that makes previously invisible aspects of one's native culture suddenly apparent. As anthropologist Edward T. Hall wrote, "The real job is not to understand foreign culture, but to understand our own. By living within completely different social realities, we begin to recognize how much of what we took as reality was actually culturally specific projection." The Brazilian educator Paulo Freire developed a literacy method based on this principle. Rather than teaching reading as a neutral skill, he helped students identify the generative themes that structured their social reality but remained invisible to them. As students became conscious of these themes, they experienced what Freire called conscientization, an awakening remarkably similar to Plato's prisoner recognizing the shadow-casting apparatus. The sixth and perhaps most direct path beyond the cave is deep attention to anomalies, experiences that don't fit our existing models of reality. Thomas Kuhn's research on scientific revolution showed that paradigm shifts typically begin when anomalous data accumulates that cannot be explained within existing frameworks. Similarly, personal paradigm shifts often begin with experiences that don't fit our existing narrative about reality. These might include synchronicities, meaningful coincidences, intuitive knowledge that later proves accurate, shared dreams, or other phenomena that our materialist framework struggles to accommodate. Most people simply dismiss such experiences, forcing them to fit existing explanations or ignoring them entirely. Just as Plato's prisoners might dismiss unusual shadows as aberrations rather than hints of a reality beyond their wall. But some individuals attend carefully to these anomalies, allowing them to accumulate until they necessitate a framework revision. This approach doesn't require abandoning critical thinking. Quite the opposite. It requires applying rigorous attention to all available data, especially data that challenges our existing models. As astronomer Maria Mitchell observed, the world of learning is so broad, and the human soul is so limited in power. We reach forth and strain every nerve, but we seize only a bit of the curtain that hides the infinite from us. What these six paths share is their ability to temporarily suspend our ordinary construction of reality, creating spaces where we might glimpse what lies beyond our habitual perception. They don't all work for everyone, and each carries distinct benefits and risks. But together, they suggest ways of at least beginning to turn from the shadows toward whatever casts them. If we truly are still in Plato's cave, what might we find when we begin to emerge? The allegory suggests a graduated process, first recognizing the shadow-casting mechanism, then adapting to increasingly direct perceptions of reality. Those who have traveled these paths report remarkably consistent discoveries, regardless of which approach they took. They describe experiencing reality as fundamentally unified rather than fragmented, encountering consciousness as intrinsic to reality rather than an isolated phenomenon, and recognizing love or fundamental interconnection as a basic cosmic principle rather than merely a human emotion. Of course, these reports could themselves be projections, new shadows rather than true perceptions. But their cross-cultural consistency is striking, as is their alignment with emerging scientific frameworks like quantum mechanics, which increasingly suggest that observer and observed cannot be fundamentally separated. Physicist Max Planck, founder of quantum theory, stated, "I regard consciousness as fundamental. I regard matter as derivative from consciousness." This view, once considered mystical, increasingly aligns with the frontiers of physics, where reality appears more like an undivided wholeness than a collection of separate objects. If these glimpses beyond the cave reflect a deeper reality, Our modernization of Plato's allegory suggests a profound possibility. What if the shadows on our wall aren't projections of an entirely separate reality, but aspects of a unified reality that includes us? In other words, what if we aren't separate from the light source, but expressions of it, temporarily experiencing a perspective that makes separateness seem real? This reimagining doesn't make our cave dwelling less consequential. If anything, it makes it more significant. We aren't just passive perceivers of shadows, but active participants in how reality manifests. Our liberation matters not just for ourselves, but for reality itself. As physicist John Wheeler suggested, no phenomenon is a real phenomenon until it is an observed phenomenon. In this framework, consciousness doesn't just perceive reality, it participates in its ongoing creation. This participation becomes especially significant when we consider that our modern shadows aren't just constraining our individual perceptions. They're shaping how we collectively relate to each other and to the natural world, with increasingly dire consequences. When we mistake economic metrics like GDP for reality itself, rather than human-created shadow measures, we make decisions that destroy actual ecological systems for the sake of improving abstract numbers. When we mistake social media representations for direct connection, we sacrifice genuine relationship for its simulation. Liberation from these modern shadows isn't just philosophical. It's increasingly urgent for addressing our most pressing planetary crises. What might it mean to live beyond the modern cave? Not just in momentary glimpses, but in our everyday lives. And how might we help others turn from the shadows without triggering the defensive reaction Plato described? The answers may require both ancient wisdom and contemporary innovation. What would it mean to live beyond our modern cave? Not just in temporary glimpses, but in our everyday existence. And how might we navigate a world still largely organized around shadows, while maintaining a connection to deeper reality? These questions aren't merely philosophical. They're intensely practical for anyone who has begun to recognize the limitations of conventional perception, but must still function within society. The first challenge mirrors what Plato described in the original allegory. The freed prisoner who returns to the cave appears blind and foolish to those still enchained. His eyes, accustomed to the sun, can't quickly readjust to the darkness. Those who glimpse beyond our modern shadows often face similar challenges reintegrating with conventional society. Spiritual traditions have long recognized this difficulty. In Zen Buddhism, there's a saying, before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. The outer actions may look the same, but the inner relationship to those actions transforms completely. This points to a crucial insight. Living beyond the cave doesn't necessarily mean abandoning ordinary life. It means relating to that life from a fundamentally different perspective, recognizing the constructed nature of conventional reality while still engaging with it skillfully. The 13th century Zen master Dogen called this practice enlightenment, the integration of profound insight with everyday activity. Rather than setting up an artificial division between spiritual experiences and mundane life, this approach recognizes that chopping can itself be an expression of awakened awareness. Similarly, the Tibetan Buddhist tradition offers the concept of crazy wisdom, behavior that appears irrational from conventional perspective but emerges from deeper insight. The crazy wisdom practitioner doesn't reject social conventions out of rebellion, but sees through them while still using them when beneficial. The Indian philosopher Nagarjuna captured this integrated perspective, for whom emptiness is possible. Everything is possible. Recognizing the constructed, empty nature of conventional reality doesn't negate that reality, but liberates us to engage with it more flexibly and compassionately. Modern psychology offers parallel frameworks. Developmental psychologist Robert Kegan describes multiple orders of consciousness, each representing a more comprehensive way of organizing experience. At higher orders, A person can simultaneously hold multiple perspectives, including conventional views, while recognizing their limitations. Psychologist Jean Piaget noted that mature cognitive development doesn't discard earlier stages, but integrates them into more comprehensive frameworks. The child who learns that volume is conserved when water changes containers doesn't stop perceiving the visual difference. They simply understand it differently. Similarly, seeing beyond our modern cave doesn't mean we stop perceiving conventional reality. We simply perceive it as one level of organization within a more comprehensive reality, like recognizing that the solid-seeming table is simultaneously a collection of atoms that are mostly empty space. This integrated perspective allows us to engage with social conventions, economic systems, and technological tools without being unconsciously determined by them. We can use language while remembering that words are maps, not territories, participate in social consensus while recognizing its constructed nature, and utilize technology while remaining aware of how it shapes perception. The 20th century spiritual teacher G.I. Gurdjieff described this as being in the world but not of it, fully engaged with ordinary reality while maintaining connection to something beyond it. This doesn't create division, but bridges different levels of understanding. But how do we maintain this bridge in practical terms? Several approaches have proven effective across traditions. First is the cultivation of regular contemplative practice. Just as muscles need consistent exercise to maintain strength, our capacity to perceive beyond conventional reality requires regular reinforcement. Whether through meditation, prayer, time in nature, or other practices, dedicating specific time to stepping outside our usual perceptual frameworks helps maintain access to broader awareness. Research on long-term meditators shows they maintain distinct neural patterns even when not actively meditating. Their baseline brain activity differs from non-meditators in ways that suggest more flexible, less rigid information processing. Regular practice doesn't just create temporary states, but gradually shifts traits, making the capacity to see beyond conventional frameworks more readily available in everyday life. Second is developing communities of practice, relationships with others who share awareness of the cave's limitations. The social nature of perception makes it difficult to maintain unconventional awareness in isolation. When everyone around us treats shadows as ultimate reality, our own perception tends to realign with that consensus unless reinforced by alternative social validation. Throughout history, those seeking to maintain awareness beyond conventional frameworks have formed communities, from monastic orders to mystery schools to contemporary practice groups. These communities provide what sociologist Peter Berger called plausibility structures, social reinforcement that makes unconventional perceptions feel real and sustainable. Today, such communities take diverse forms. Some are organized around spiritual traditions, others around artistic practices, ecological activism, or scientific exploration of consciousness. What matters isn't the specific form, but the shared commitment to seeing beyond conventional limitations while supporting each other in integrating that vision with ordinary life. Third is developing symbolic systems that bridge conventional and deeper realities. Art, music, poetry, ritual, and other symbolic forms can communicate insights that literal language struggles to express. These forms don't just describe alternative perceptions, but can temporarily induce them in others. Throughout history, art has served as a technology for shifting perception. From cave paintings to cathedrals, from Zen gardens to abstract expressionism, artists have created environments that temporarily disrupt conventional perception and open viewers to alternative ways of seeing. The poet William Blake described his work as helping others cleanse the doors of perception. The composer John Cage used silence and randomness to help listeners break habitual patterns of hearing. Such artistic innovations aren't merely aesthetic, but potentially transformative. creating temporary openings in the walls of our perceptual cave. Fourth is developing frameworks that integrate multiple levels of reality rather than denying either conventional or deeper perspectives. The 20th century philosopher Ken Wilber calls this approach integral, emphasizing that more comprehensive awareness doesn't reject previous stages, but includes them within broader contexts. Physicist David Bohm proposed a similar concept with his theory of implicate and explicate orders. The explicate order is the world of separate objects and conventional causality, the realm of shadows in our analogy. The implicate order is the deeper reality in which these apparently separate phenomena are actually unified patterns in a single underlying field, comparable to the world outside Plato's cave. Crucially, Bohm didn't suggest that the explicate order is simply false. It's a valid level of organization, just not the most fundamental one. Living beyond the cave means being able to shift between these orders of reality as appropriate, rather than getting stuck in either. Modern cognitive science supports this multi-level approach. Researcher Ian McGilchrist's work on brain hemispheres suggests that we have neural systems specialized for both detailed, categorical perception, left hemisphere, and holistic, contextual awareness, right hemisphere. Optimal functioning comes not from prioritizing either system, but from their appropriate integration and balanced interaction. This suggests that living beyond the cave doesn't mean abandoning analytical thinking or practical engagement with conventional reality. It means developing the capacity to move fluidly between different modes of perception, recognizing when each is appropriate. The fifth approach involves reclaiming the language of knowing itself. Our modern conception of knowledge is heavily biased toward explicit, verbal, quantifiable information, knowledge that can be written down, taught formally, and tested. But many traditions recognize other ways of knowing that access aspects of reality that conventional cognition misses. Indigenous knowledge systems typically integrate intellectual, embodied, emotional, ecological, and spiritual ways of knowing without hierarchically ranking them. Knowledge isn't just stored in books or databases, but in bodies, relationships, stories, and practices. Feminist epistemologists have similarly challenged the assumption that detached, impersonal analysis provides the most comprehensive knowledge. Philosopher Lorraine Code's concept of ecological thinking emphasizes how knowledge emerges from situated, embodied engagement with specific contexts rather than abstract application of universal principles. These expanded epistemologies aren't rejections of rational inquiry, but recognitions of its limitations when divorced from other ways of knowing. Living beyond the cave means drawing on multiple epistemological resources, including but not limited to conventional rationality. The sixth approach involves reclaiming attention itself. In our modern information environment, attention has become a commodity, extracted and monetized by platforms designed to capture and hold it. Liberating perception requires reclaiming sovereignty over what we attend to and how we attend to it. Practices like mindfulness train not just concentration, but meta-attention, the capacity to notice where and how we're directing awareness. This meta-awareness allows us to recognize when our attention is being manipulated and consciously redirect it toward what we deem valuable. As philosopher Simone Weil wrote, attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity. Directing attention intentionally becomes a way of valuing reality on its own terms rather than through the filters of utility or entertainment. One practical method involves regular information fasts, periods of deliberately disconnecting from digital inputs to allow different attentional patterns to emerge. Research shows that even brief nature immersion without digital devices measurably shifts cognitive function toward more integrative, less fragmented awareness. Living beyond the cave doesn't require permanent disconnection from modern society, a retreat to literal caves or isolated monasteries. Instead, it involves developing the capacity to recognize and temporarily step outside our conventional perceptual frameworks, maintaining connection to broader reality, even while functioning within conventional systems. This integrated approach has profound implications for how we address our most pressing collective challenges. Many of today's global crises, from climate change to social fragmentation, stem directly from mistaking shadows for reality. We sacrifice ecological systems for economic abstractions, genuine connection for social media metrics, and lived well-being for consumption statistics. These aren't just policy failures, but perception failures. Collective versions of Plato's prisoners optimizing for shadows while destroying the actual world. Living beyond the cave means bringing broader awareness to our collective decisions, recognizing when we're sacrificing reality for its representation. This doesn't require everyone to have mystical awakenings. It simply requires enough of us to maintain connection to what's real beyond our conceptual maps that we can help redirect collective attention and action. The environmental activist Joanna Macy calls this the Great Turning, a shift from an industrial growth society based on abstract metrics to a life-sustaining civilization grounded in ecological reality. This isn't just a policy change, but a perceptual revolution, turning from shadows toward the living world that casts them. Similarly, transforming our social systems requires recognizing how concepts like economic value, success, and progress function as shadow metrics that often obscure rather than reveal actual human flourishing. Living beyond the cave means developing and implementing metrics that better align with reality as directly experienced rather than abstractly conceptualized. This doesn't mean abandoning rationality or scientific inquiry. Quite the opposite. It means integrating these powerful tools with other ways of knowing to create more comprehensive understanding. The scientific method itself emerged as a way to see beyond the shadows of dogma and superstition. At its best, science continues this liberation by constantly questioning its own frameworks. As physicist Richard Feynman stated, the first principle is that you must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool. This scientific commitment to questioning one's own perception aligns perfectly with the journey beyond Plato's cave. Living beyond the cave means bringing this questioning spirit to all domains, not dismissing conventional frameworks, but recognizing their limitations and complementing them with broader awareness. It means remembering that maps are not territories, models are not reality, and measurements are not what they measure. Most importantly, it means recognizing that reality itself is vastly more complex, interconnected, and mysterious than any of our representations can capture. The humility this recognition engenders isn't weakness, but wisdom, the beginning of genuine understanding. In the original allegory, Plato suggests that those who glimpse reality beyond the cave have a duty to return and help liberate others, despite the difficulties and dangers this entails. This ethical dimension remains crucial in our modern context. Living beyond the cave isn't just personal liberation, but social responsibility, using our expanded perception to help address suffering that stems from collective illusion. This doesn't mean imposing our perspective on others, but skillfully inviting them to question their own perceptual limitations. As the Zen teacher Thich Nhat Hanh observed, the most precious gift we can offer others is our presence. When mindfulness embraces those we love, they will bloom like flowers. This quality of presence, free from projection and preconception, may be the most direct way to help others glimpse reality beyond shadows. The journey beyond our modern cave isn't completed in a single enlightenment experience, but continues throughout life as we integrate glimpses of deeper reality with everyday functioning. It's not about escaping the world, but perceiving and engaging with it more completely, recognizing both its conventional structures and what lies beyond them. This integration doesn't eliminate the challenges of human existence. The freed prisoner still needs to navigate the physical world, interact with those who haven't left the cave, and address practical concerns. But these challenges are faced from a fundamentally different perspective, one that recognizes the relative nature of conventional reality without dismissing its practical importance. As we develop this integrated perspective, we may discover something remarkable. The shadows themselves take on new significance. When recognized as representations rather than ultimate reality, they can be appreciated for what they genuinely offer. Useful maps for navigating particular domains, even if incomplete. Living beyond the cave doesn't mean leaving everything behind, but seeing it all within a larger context. A context that includes but transcends our human projections. This expanded perception doesn't separate us from ordinary life, but allows us to engage with it more fully, deeply, and compassionately. And that may be the most liberating discovery of all. As we conclude our exploration of the modern cave, let's return to where we began. Look again at the device in your hand or on your desk. The screen you're reading these words on right now. Is this technology liberating you from ignorance, as we often assume? Or is it projecting new shadows, more convincing but no less illusory than those Plato described? The answer, perhaps, is both. Our modern tools, concepts, and institutions simultaneously illuminate certain aspects of reality while casting shadows that obscure others. They aren't simply good or bad, liberating or imprisoning. They're complex technologies of perception that shape how we experience ourselves and our world in ways we rarely fully recognize. The journey beyond Plato's cave isn't about rejecting these tools or the conventional realities they help construct. It's about developing the capacity to recognize them as tools rather than truths. Useful in specific contexts, but always partial, always perspectival, always abstracting from a reality that exceeds all our representations. This recognition doesn't diminish the value of our conceptual frameworks, technological developments, or social systems. In many ways, it enhances their value by clarifying what they can and cannot offer. Maps are invaluable precisely when we remember they aren't the territory. Models serve us best when we recall their models. Living beyond the cave means developing this dual awareness, using our conventional frameworks skillfully while remembering their provisional constructions, not ultimate realities. This isn't about achieving some final enlightenment that transcends all perspectives. It's about becoming increasingly flexible in how we perceive, able to shift between different ways of seeing as appropriate to different contexts. The Zen tradition calls this not one, not two, neither collapsing different levels of reality into a single framework nor treating them as entirely separate domains. Different perspectives aren't hierarchically ranked from false to true, but recognized as revealing different aspects of a reality too comprehensive for any single framework to capture completely. This integrative vision has appeared in different forms across cultures and eras. The medieval European concept of the great chain of being recognized multiple levels of reality, each valid in its domain while pointing beyond itself. Indigenous knowledge systems typically integrate practical, ecological, social, and spiritual understandings without reducing any to the others. Even modern complexity science recognizes how different levels of organization, from quantum fields to chemical systems to biological organisms to social structures, each operate by principles that can't be fully reduced to the levels below. These diverse approaches all point toward a similar insight. Reality is stratified, and different modes of perception access different strata. Seeing beyond the cave doesn't mean abandoning the level of conventional reality, but recognizing it as one layer within a more comprehensive whole. This recognition transforms how we relate to our perceptual limitations. Rather than seeing them as problems to overcome through ever more sophisticated technologies or concepts, we might recognize them as inherent to embodied, perspectival existence. No perspective can be complete precisely because it's a perspective, a view from somewhere particular rather than a view from nowhere. But this inherent partiality doesn't make our perspectives worthless. Quite the opposite. It makes the multiplicity of perspectives precious, each revealing aspects of reality that others might miss. Living beyond the cave means valuing this multiplicity rather than seeking some final, comprehensive framework that would render all others obsolete. As physicist Niels Bohr recognized in developing his concept of complementarity, certain aspects of reality can only be revealed through frameworks that appear contradictory. The wave and particle aspects of light, for instance, can't be observed simultaneously, yet both are necessary for a more complete understanding. Different perspectives don't compete as right versus wrong, but complement each other as partial revelations of a reality too rich for any single framework to exhaust. This complementary approach applies not just to scientific frameworks, but to cultural, philosophical, and spiritual perspectives as well. Different traditions haven't simply gotten reality right or wrong. They've developed tools for revealing different aspects of a multidimensional reality. Living beyond the cave means becoming increasingly adept at navigating these multiple dimensions, developing what philosopher Jean Gebser called integral consciousness, capable of moving fluidly between different modes of perception without being trapped in any single one. This fluidity doesn't mean abandoning discernment. Some perspectives genuinely reveal more than others in particular domains, and some frameworks create more suffering than others when mistaken for complete accounts of reality. The integrative vision isn't relativistic in the sense of treating all perspectives as equally valid for all purposes. It's pluralistic in recognizing the legitimate diversity of ways reality can be known, each with its appropriate domains and limitations. As we develop this more fluid, integrative relationship with our perceptual frameworks, something remarkable can happen. The distinction between inside and outside the cave begins to dissolve. We recognize that we never completely escape our perspectives. Yet within this recognition, a different kind of freedom emerges. It's the freedom not from perspective, but within perspective. The capacity to relate to our frameworks as frameworks rather than confusing them with reality itself. This doesn't eliminate the shadows, but transforms our relationship with them, allowing us to use them consciously rather than being unconsciously used by them. The philosopher Ken Wilber describes this as the shift from to freedom, for not escaping the human condition, but embracing its full depth and possibility. The journey isn't about leaving the cave once and for all, but about developing the capacity to move between different levels of reality, each valuable in its domain. This movement isn't just philosophical, but practical. It's about becoming increasingly skillful in how we deploy different perceptual frameworks, knowing when analytical thinking is appropriate and when embodied wisdom better serves, when to rely on quantitative metrics and when qualitative understanding reveals more, when conventional social scripts support flourishing and when they constrain it. Living beyond the cave means developing this meta-awareness, not a view from nowhere, but a capacity to recognize and shift between different somewheres, each revealing aspects of reality invisible to the others. The implications of this shift extend far beyond individual perception. Our most pressing collective challenges, from climate change to social polarization to technological governance, stem largely from confusing our models with reality itself. We sacrifice actual ecosystems for economic abstractions, genuine community for political ideologies, and lived experience for technological optimization. Addressing these challenges doesn't require abandoning our frameworks, but recognizing their constructed nature and limitations. It means holding them more lightly, deploying them more consciously, and remaining open to perspectives they might exclude. This openness isn't weakness, but strength. The capacity to integrate multiple ways of knowing rather than restricting ourselves to increasingly narrow specializations. The most effective responses to complex challenges typically come not from doubling down on single frameworks, but from creatively integrating insights from diverse perspectives. The journey beyond Plato's cave, reimagined for our modern context, isn't about achieving some final enlightenment that would place us outside all frameworks. It's about developing increasingly comprehensive, flexible, and conscious relationships with the frameworks we inevitably use. In this journey, we don't leave the shadows behind so much as recognize what casts them, allowing us to relate to them as shadows rather than mistaking them for ultimate reality. This recognition doesn't diminish their utility, but clarifies it, helping us deploy our conceptual, technological, and social tools more skillfully and compassionately. The freed prisoner in Plato's allegory doesn't gain the ability to see without eyes. He learns to use his eyes differently, recognizing how vision works, what it reveals, and what it necessarily occludes. Similarly, living beyond our modern cave doesn't mean transcending our human perspectives, but becoming increasingly conscious of how they shape everything we perceive. This consciousness doesn't eliminate the shaping. We remain perspectival beings, viewing reality from particular locations with particular capacities and limitations. But within this recognition lies an extraordinary possibility: the capacity to hold our perspectives lightly, deploy them skillfully, and remain open to what they might miss. As we develop this capacity, we may discover that reality itself functions less like a fixed domain that perspectives try to represent, and more like a creative unfolding that perspectives actively participate in. Our frameworks don't just show us what's out there, but help bring it into being through how we attend, interpret, and respond. This participatory understanding doesn't mean reality is whatever we decide, a naive constructivism that would simply replace physical shadows with mental ones. It means recognizing that how we perceive is part of what we perceive, not because reality is purely subjective, but because the boundary between perceiver and perceived is itself a construct that only partially captures their relationship. Living beyond the cave means appreciating this creative interplay between perception and reality, neither projecting our frameworks onto a passive world, nor passively receiving inputs from an independent one, but participating in a dynamic relationship that exceeds all our categories while making use of them. As physicist and philosopher Arthur Eddington wrote, "We have found that where science has progressed the farthest, the mind has but regained from nature that which the mind has put into nature. We have found a strange footprint on the shores of the unknown. We have devised profound theories, one after another, to account for its origin. At last, we have succeeded in reconstructing the creature that made the footprint. And lo, it is our own." This recognition doesn't collapse reality into human projection. It expands humanity to include its participation in a reality that exceeds it. The boundary between inside and outside the cave, between shadow and substance, turns out to be itself a shadow of sorts, a useful distinction in certain contexts, but not an absolute division. Living beyond the cave means learning to navigate this paradoxical territory, using distinctions while recognizing their provisional nature, deploying frameworks while remaining open to what they exclude, and participating in conventional realities while maintaining connection to what exceeds them. This isn't a journey with a final destination, a point where we could say, "Now, I see reality as it truly is, independent of all perspective." It's an ongoing process of becoming increasingly conscious of perspective itself, increasingly skilled in shifting between different ways of seeing, and increasingly open to the mystery that exceeds all our frameworks. As the Zen master Dogen wrote, "To study the Buddha way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be actualized by myriad things." Perhaps that's the most profound insight the Cave Allegory still offers us today. True liberation doesn't come from escaping perspective, but from no longer being confined by it, able to move fluidly between different ways of seeing, different modes of knowing, different dimensions of being. This fluidity doesn't eliminate the shadows. It transforms our relationship with them, allowing us to use them consciously as the useful tools they are while remaining connected to the reality they simultaneously reveal and conceal. And in that transformed relationship, we might discover not just new ways of seeing, but new ways of being, more conscious, more compassionate, and more creative in how we engage with ourselves, each other, and the remarkable reality we jointly inhabit. The shadows remain, but they need not define the limits of our world.